what a lot of companies do is they look at cost control as the way to manage their price declines as their product. And the problem is that they don't equate that with the supply and the demand equation. So they're basically sharpening a pencil sharper and sharper when they really need a pen. And at a certain point, you sharpen that pencil, it's going to break. So using proper process control, like you guys know a heck of a lot about, and ERPs and technology and data analytics is absolutely critical, but to what strategic purpose? For me, it's to get more consistency, get more reliability on production, get more reliability in supply chain, do all of the, simplify your business from a complexity standpoint, take all those savings and reinvest it in differentiated products, reinvest it in innovation, something that's going to impact the top line of your revenue.
What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of The Dime. I'm Brian Fields, and with me, as always, is Kellen Finney. And this week, we got a very special guest, Mitch Osak. Mitch, thanks for taking the time. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on.
Excited to dive in. Kellen, how are you?
Doing really well. Grateful to get the chance to talk to Mitch today. How are you doing, Brian?
Yeah, I'm stoked. We were having fun before we started recording about some of the best practices and some of the items that we've seen other industries pull from, and hoping that today Cannabis can learn from some of those, or just have an open mind about all the possibilities and opportunities out there. Because one, we can all agree it's very hard what's going on. Vertical integration operations are very challenging. There's fundamental disconnects from all the systems in place, and putting this all together to make high-level strategic decisions. I think Mitch does a phenomenal job of understanding all those components, and we're going to have a fun conversation dive in. But for our listeners, before we get started, Mitch, can you give a quick background on yourself and how you find your way to the cannabis space?
Okay, great. So I'm a Canadian, born and bred in Toronto. I have an MBA from the University of Toronto. My first job out of business school was in brand management at Procter & Gamble. I was on some small brands like Tide and Cascade, as well as being in their cosmetics business. So I got a really great grounding in CPG and strategy. Fast forward, I started, built and sold a robotics company. We were value-added resellers, so I learned a little bit about channel management and factory automation and so on. And following that sale, I hung out my consulting shingle, where I've spent the last 25 years consulting to pharma, CPG, financial services. In 2016, I went all in on cannabis because Canada was legalizing adult use cannabis. And it's not every day you see a massive industry move in from the shadows into the real world. And I jumped in with both feet and both arms. And most often I don't look back, but it's been an amazing ride, and I've met great people and learned some tremendous things.
Love it. So one would ask, when you got started in the cannabis space, was there a certain specific vehicle or a tap point that you were looking for? Or was it more about, hey, I can help with these variety of angles. Which one of these is most applicable to the space?
So there were basically three pillars in the Canadian industry, and that's where I got my start right around 2016. One was cultivation, two was strategy, and three was raising capital. And they're all intertwined at a certain point. So I came in and helped clients around the strategy and capital raising side. And capital raising was essentially working with Bay Street to get early stage funding into these businesses. As you know, they're high CapEx businesses. And the idea was, let's build these greenhouses, grow the best weed we can, and flood the Canadian market, hopefully the US market, and then internationally. That has half worked out and half hasn't.
So from a strategy standpoint, how does that approach work? It has to be pretty detailed enough where you've got to get an understanding of A, the inner workings of the company, what they do well, B, what they believe that they do well at, kind of have like a little assessment of like, this is what they do, this is what they don't do. And then C, maybe an understanding of where they want to go. Are all those pieces of the puzzle how you kind of put it together when you're working with them to develop like a strategic plan?
Yes, but a strategic plan is a lot like an Irish stew. And you've mentioned the potato and the beef and the carrot, but there's also celery in there. Listen, I'm not Irish, maybe Callan knows, but there's a few other ingredients. So one of them is something called best practices. Best practices are, what are your peers or people outside the industry the cannabis industry doing that you can learn. Another one might be, visioneering. Like, where is this industry potentially going? Not only in terms of rescheduling in the United States and so on and so forth, but what about biosynthesis? What about artificially making THC and CBG and CBN in a lab? So you don't need to cultivate anything anymore. So my strategic process is very holistic. It looks at the ecosystem and the company across 360 degrees. You're essentially looking at everything. And you're figuring out what's the right path to go forward. And most importantly, that's a combination of choosing what to do and choosing what not to do. And that's where a lot of the analysis comes in.
One of those areas that might seem most difficult is like getting a deeper understanding of exactly, well, Mitch, we kind of do it like this, but right now we're in this stage and we're doing it like this. Do they ever lay out those items where we're trying to get there, but currently today we do it this way?
The problem is in our industry, there's essentially two big groups of actors in it. And I'm generalizing, and I know there's more, but, I'll lay it out simply. There's like your OGs, your farmers, the people who see everything through a cultivation or a production lens. And without a doubt, those people are fundamentally critical, but they're very much influenced by certain metrics like cost to grow, throughput, yields, and things like that. And then the other group of actors are, let's call them your money people. They're the ones who put up a lot of the money. I'll also throw in the compliance folks in that group. They care a lot about return on assets, return on investment, and so on and so forth. They don't see the cannabis industry the same way as the cultivators look like. So one of the challenges is, and one of the things I hope I do, is to act as a bridge between these competing interests, competing frameworks of thinking, even competing lexicons. I'll give you one example. And you guys would know this, through your work. Ask somebody in cannabis what they want to do, and they'll say, we want to have the highest quality, best weed. And then I said, okay, that sounds good. It's like saying, I love my sister. What does that really mean? Let's unpack that. So when you start to unpack it, what you start to find is, for every 3 cultivators, they have 5 different interpretations of quality. And then the money people can have 2 different definitions of quality. No one can really often figure out what it is. And if you can't even figure out the terms, how are you going to position your product in the marketplace such that it satisfies resellers and satisfies consumers? So we have an industry that's still very immature across a lot of these dimensions. And I don't mean immature bad. We just haven't got to the consistency and standards we need to start saying, okay, this is what quality means. It means high terps or high THC or consistent product. And once we get to that, we can start building a true CPG business, which is essentially what I think cannabis is.
Do you think that the way that we get there is from just having a couple really large operators that are kind of all on the same page? They're able to agree on all of these kind of complex intricacies, and then they end up controlling a majority of the market share to kind of standardize the space. Because it seems right now this like fragmented kind of like co-op-esque vibe has just kind of created chaos, right? Especially in the States, right? I mean, I think it's a lot cleaner right now in Canada, but like, I could be wrong, but it just seems like, what are your thoughts on that?
That's an excellent question. So, I'll rephrase it in a way. What you just said was clearly understandable to me, but I'll rephrase it in a way in the Canadian context. So there's 2 ways that the industry is evolving towards this sort of standardization or this equilibrium, so to speak, around product and cultivation. And one is a ground up approach, where industry players get together and say, you know what, this is how we're going to rate or rank cannabis. In industries like, let's say, the automotive industry, you kind of know exotic supercars or Lamborghini and McLaren and Ferrari. You kind of know that in Porsche. And you know that the entry levels are sort of Hyundai and Kia, and there's a couple of others. And, through advertising or what have you, consumer mindsets and even producer mindsets coalesce around that. We don't have that in cannabis anywhere because we don't have enough time. We don't have enough education of the consumer and so on. So in Canada, they're trying to build up those standards from the ground up. That is a tough haul. The other side of it, Callan, which you've correctly identified, is the market imposing what those standards and what those definitions are. And we've seen that in a whole host of industries. And that's what we're starting to see in Canada to a great extent, as well as the United States. The difference, though, in Canada is that I'm not sure it's the biggest players doing it, because in Canada, the largest cannabis companies are actually declining as a share of the total market. You have this other cadre of middle market firms that are coming up. And those middle market firms are the ones who are saying, okay, when we're cultivating organic cannabis, this is what it means. And when we're talking about quality and they have a house of brand strategy, it's the right quality at the right price in the right format. And that's what the car industry is to a great extent, right? So, it is starting to coalesce and happen. It's going too slowly, but I imagine it'll be driven top down by companies through M&A and consolidation than it is bottom up. The problem with bottom up, as you know, is that if you can't get people to agree on what quality is, how they're going to approach and agree on a standard. But the standards will appear like they do in every other industry eventually.
Why do you think the middle companies are siphoning market and share from the big boys?
Okay, great question. Big question. I'm going to summarize it very quickly, and I'm not going to use the cliches that you hear a lot about. It's not about good weed versus bad weed. It's not about that. To me, what it's about strategic focus, and it's about being closer to the customer. I don't want to mention any names of large Canadian LPs or MSOs.
Just the three of us.
Yeah, it's true. So the problem with the bigger players is that they try and be all things to all people. Even in U.S. cannabis, you've got MSOs that have gotten into the hemp beverage space. So they've entered literally a new category. They don't know their own cannabis category well enough yet. And now they decided, let's chase growth in a completely new thing that could be shut down with a new farm bill. So it's not a function of quality because, some people want glass house quality, the best and highest buzz for the lowest price. And other people want craft cannabis that comes from Humboldt County or BC. What it is to me is strategic focus and sticking to your knitting. So those mid-sized Canadian companies and SSOs in the United States are doing a few things really well and focusing on continuous improvement to get there. And that continuous improvement is driving down the cost curve, because there is margin compression, we know that. And also just getting way closer to what consumers want and consumer trends, like infused pre-rolls and, soft gels and things that are at the vanguard of emerging consumer trends, not only around getting high, but also wellness and things like that.
I want to hit a few of the points back because I think it's really important. So from a vertical integration standpoint, these companies are essentially running 6, 7 different businesses. So when they expand into the hemp market, what's 8, 9, and 10, right? At this point now, they're like, we're just doing a ton of different businesses. Just layer on top. Johnny always handles our new expansion. He can handle 1 or 2 more. What's the difference at this point? But I'm with you, right? It's madness and it's chaos. And it turns out when you do everything subpar, you do nothing well. And right now it's okay and it might work. But as consolidation happens, compression happens, and what you do better than everyone else becomes the same thing that every other industry operates in. What do you do toe to toe better than everyone else? And it turns out a lot of these companies have no idea what that exactly is. And I think that to me is the scariest part of this whole entire industry is we've got all these companies doing a few things. Okay. They've got a bunch of other areas in their supply chain that are fundamentally a disaster, but they don't even want to acknowledge it right now because it works and it's just not their core focus problem, but will be as the game starts to shift more and more. And I think those are the areas that you're talking about, these middle level operators that are just doubling down on exactly like, we're going to own cultivation. We're going to own cultivation for craft. We're going to own extraction. We're going to do this better than anyone else. And when the swords come down and we have to fight, we know we can compete on this specific area and beat anyone else. And I think that's the difference from a USP standpoint.
Yeah, and I'll add, and I'm not a Procter & Gamble cult member, although sometimes I sound like one. But,
Ride or die.
When we were at P&G, we acknowledged we weren't the lowest cost manufacturer. We acknowledged we never had the best sales teams. We acknowledged a lot of our failings, and we made conscious strategic choices not to be that. But we said to ourselves, no one is going to be better at mining consumer insights. Number one. Number two is no one is going to be better at taking those insights and turning them into market-leading mass premium products. So we went for market dominance or we weren't interested, right? And it was all based on that insight. And then number three, no one was going to market and advertise those products better than us. In none of those areas that I just described, manufacturing, selling, being the best corporate citizen, being the best in corporate finance, P&G was pretty good at it. They had billions of dollars to hire talent. They just couldn't focus all there. So you just hit the nail on the head in that, I speak to lots of management teams and, sadly, and I beg them to hire me. And even on a sort of a diagnostic at their business, because I don't think a lot of them actually understand what they're really good at. And every company and every person has superpowers. If they've been sticking around long enough, they sometimes don't know what that is. So uncovering that superpower and then doubling down on it is the key to success for some of these companies. But they don't even want to do that sometimes because either they're afraid or hubris, or they're running around with their heads cut off like chickens. And they're in those 10 lines of business where not only they're not putting up the numbers, but it's sucking capital and resources away from doing the right things right, which is really about strategic thinking.
That's where it's the scariest, right? Because someone is internally, maybe it's an ego, maybe it's a fear, maybe it's like, Mitch is going to find some things that are going to make me look not great. And I'm worried how that might make me look to the board. But this is where I think people need to understand that right now, the industry is insanely hard. And teams are probably understaffed, underutilized. They lack resources. They definitely don't have all the capital they need. So having someone like yourself who's seen all these different verticals and best practices come in and just health check the industry, look at what they're doing, provide a secondary set of eyes can be helpful. And even if you don't work with them, just by hearing your feedback might open up them saying, you know what? We need to relook at this. We need to consider doing this. And that information might change their business just by having the openness and willingness to consider outside opinion.
Yeah. And listen, I'm not going to say I have all the answers. And I was around a lot of companies in the early days giving advice that didn't always work out because, and you guys know this, there was no playbook for this industry. To a great extent, there's still no playbook. A lot of the publicly available data is crap, okay? I know it because I've broken it down. I've got children who are statisticians who look at the methodologies and go, what? How do you make those conclusions over the sets of data? I mean, you guys are data experts. You know this very well. So when you have garbage data in with people with no playbook, when you've got to make multi-million-dollar decisions, that's a recipe for problems. It's hard to go into a company. I want to be very clear and say, it's like me going into your house and saying, your dog's ugly. You're not going to want to hear that. And you're not going to want to hear that, to your point, because you're fully vested in this. You've raised the money and so on and so forth. The challenge in these businesses, and this is my tack right now, is it clearly is not working for a lot of these companies. It might be time for a new approach because if everybody's trying to cut their costs and you're not going to have the economies of scale to beat somebody else, if you connect the dots, and I do a lot of industry analysis on growing costs and margin compression, it's not hard to figure out you're going to lose that race. While you still have runway, maybe it's a better approach to say, how do we take these assets and repurpose them? How do we stay in certain lanes and avoid others? And you got to be willing to have that conversation and look at the data. A lot of people aren't willing to do that.
But the data can sometimes be very misleading. And some teams think they've got a clear pipeline of systems for accurate data. And it turns out it's the wrong KPIs. They're not connected throughout the supply chain, or the story gets told differently too late in the process, where the CFO is looking at, just our example, they're looking at the yields and they're like, why are these yields down? Let's go back to manufacturing. And then at that point there, the process is too delayed for anyone to make any decisions. Things have already continued to spiral out. So are there tools or are there systems in place for you in order to better understand where strategically they can figure out, like, how deep of an audit are you doing from a health check standpoint in order to understand under the hood exactly where there could be opportunities to improve?
Okay, so I don't want to pitch my services now, but I want to build on one of the things you just said, because people will buy my services, I hope, much more after they hear this explanation. So when I got started in this industry, 2016, 17, 18, it was all about cost to grow. How do you go down that cost curve as quickly as possible? So in every pitch deck of people raising money, they'd say this greenhouse would allow us to grow at 75 cents a gram, and this greenhouse 65 cents and it was all about driving down unit cost to grow. It wasn't about quality or consistency. It wasn't about risk averse. It was a clumsy, blunt metric, to your point. It was the wrong metric for a startup company. Because you know what happened? They built these cathedrals of glass, half million square feet. They're growing in one grow room. They can't even grow anything. They have no sense of pest control. Like who cared about unit cost when you can't even grow one thing and there was no demand for it? The cannabis world in Canada and in the United States finally got away from that. And then we start talking about terpenes and all this kind of stuff. And I thought we were on our way to actually starting to sell products that people wanted and that was going to fly off the shelves and not come back in terms of inventory and buybacks. Now I see, and I'm not going to call out any names, that original sin of unit costs are coming back with some MSOs. And what's bizarre to me, and I've had some words with some of the cheerleaders in the industry, is that now it's absolutely the wrong time. Why? Because the unit cost as a percentage of your total cost is so low, it actually, okay, you save a penny or 2 pennies by growing a little cheaper. Like, so what? It's really not going to change your bottom line. What will change your bottom line is focusing on consistency and quality so you could charge 10% more for that gram of flour, right? So where they should be going, okay, what does the consistency mean? They're fighting yesterday's battle. And I'm saying, forget about the grow costs. Get consistency. Hit that 25 or 30% THC level, and you'll boost your earnings 20, 30% through sell-through. You see? So again, back to the point you just said, Brian, the wrong metrics measured the wrong way and not understood strategically and within the strategic palette of, if we're a CPG company, there's the price you get and the cost to grow things. Don't only look at the cost to grow, look at the price you can get through advertising, promotion, and unique product. So this industry always seems to be behind the 8 ball on stuff like that.
As a pushback though, Mitch, I would say,
please,
a lot of these companies raised capital. They built that glass cathedral, right? And in order to increase quality and do all these things you're preaching, that might require more capital. Maybe they do need these sensors. Maybe they need to hire a more cultivation experience, right? That then, how do you answer their question where they're like, hey, we just don't have the capital, so they don't have that lever to pull. And then they're looking at their business and they're like, the only levers we have are to cut costs now, right? And so what's your response to that?
That's not a pushback because we're in violent agreement. I'm all for cutting costs.
Yeah.
But what do you do but how much focus is on the cut the cost? A lot, but where is that extra gross profit going? See, what we see now in every legal market, and this is a lot of the proprietary analysis I've seen, you get price declines and margin compression very quickly, and often as soon as 14, 15 months. And we're going to start to see it in Ohio, for example, very soon. So what a lot of companies do is they look at cost control as the way to manage their price declines as their product. And the problem is that they don't equate that with the supply and the demand equation. So they're basically sharpening a pencil sharper and sharper when they really need a pen. And at a certain point, you sharpen that pencil, it's going to break. So using proper process control, like you guys know a heck of a lot about, and ERPs and technology and data analytics is absolutely critical, but to what strategic purpose? For me, it's to get more consistency, get more reliability on production, get more reliability in supply chain, do all of the, simplify your business from a complexity standpoint, take all those savings and reinvest it in differentiated products, reinvest it in innovation, something that's going to impact the top line of your revenue and either stem those price declines or get you an ability to actually take up pricing, which people have been able to do certainly in Canada with premium and mass premium products. And what we find in Canada right now is that price levels are actually going up when you still have a lot of capacity in the industry right now. So I look at the cost reductions and the efficiency gains and so on as an enabler to deliver on broader strategic priorities, like being niche players or separating yourself on the path or differentiation. If somebody wants to be like Glass House, where it's all about being the Walmart of weed, that's great. That is a compelling strategy. But in every market, you're not going to have a dozen glass houses. You're going to have a couple, and then that's it. So unless you're Glass House, forget it. You got to use your savings for other purposes, and that's what I'm talking about.
It seems like, though, the hardest part is that what got you here today is not what's going to get you to the next level. And cannabis makes it even harder because they don't pull from these outside industry best practices. Like when we talk about process efficiency, these approaches aren't new, right? They're just tried and true in other industries. And I think that's the element that I'm most optimistic about and excited to see get applied here to cannabis, is because right now we just make it harder for ourselves. And I understand the willingness to change is very difficult. People are fearful of capital. They understand that if we're going to invest in this technology, it has to work. We have to apply it. But these investments are probably what's necessary in order to go from where you are today to where that next level is. And that all starts with an understanding that what got us here prior is not what's going to get us to the next level, because we all know in this industry, the strategy continues to evolve because of the regulations and the way the approaches work. And we have to be forward-looking, not reactive, exactly like you said, Mitch.
Yeah, so, it's an excellent point. I've spent more time outside of cannabis than in it. And again, I'm not trying to crap all over my brothers and sisters in the industry. I got a lot of respect for people who put their own money, their livelihoods on the line to build these businesses. They came in from the shadows. These are heroes in my mind. But to your point, Brian, this ain't Kansas anymore. And as I mentioned earlier, these new markets in the United States follow a very similar trajectory. I mean, it could be off 6 months or what have you. But at a certain point, it's rapid growth, high demand, rapid supply, boom. And the products start to change, and we start moving away from flower. These sort of dynamics happen in the tech industry. They happen in CPG. They happen in defense contractor. They happen in apparel, retail for sure. So again, what I say to my cannabis brothers and sisters is, get out of this echo chamber that you're in, that you think this is such a unique industry. Yes, it is unique, without a doubt. Very unique regulations, stigma. I absolutely get it. But at the end of the day, there's the laws of the business cycle, and there's laws of capitalism, where there's only so many companies that can exist in a space, and everybody eats and survive. And the best model that I find for cannabis, believe it or not, there's three that cannabis should be looking at. And in no order of priority, one is the wine industry, where you have the inevitable consolidation, plus a lot of little boutique wineries that are barely hanging on, and they're hobby businesses, essentially. But you have the big players like Robert Mondavi and so on, and you have production all around the world. It's not only coming from France and Italy, like those snobs always thought it would for 200 years. You have countries like the United States and California and Canada and Australia come in and kick their butts because they took their technology, they took their grower, they took everything and replicated it along the same longitude and latitude, roughly, that was in Bordeaux and Côte d'Ivoire and so on. So, this is going to become, and it is becoming, an international industry, but it's going to mirror or ape other ones. So the other two sectors, very quickly, fashion, new fashion comes and goes by season. We see that with flower. We see that with products. Very few people in cannabis look at this as a fashion industry, but if you look at the fundamentals, very similar. And the last thing is tech. High CapEx, coming out with minimum viable products. You start to own the whole consumer relationship. Again, a lot of similarities with tech and with cannabis. Cannabis is probably an amalgam of all three of those. But if we start looking through different lenses at this industry, a lot of companies are going to start doing different things and being smarter at things, actually.
I think that's what makes it so difficult, right? Is that you've got all these different industries blended up together, and then you've got different rules and regs per state, so you have to sped up different supply chains in different neighboring areas, which just layer to the complexity. So exactly like you're saying is, I think this is the part of me that makes it really optimistic in recognizing that, like, so far, cannabis is as challenging of an industry as I've ever seen in my opportunities here and working, and then recognizing that the opportunities in front of them can get easier, but involve an internal look. So when people do reach out to you, Mitch, is there like a common theme that people say? Is it more really high level, or do they come to you and say, hey, I think I have a specific problem here. Can you help me with why?
Yeah, so it's the latter. Most companies are fighting for survival. In Canada, we have, let's say, a dozen, probably more companies that have turned a corner and becoming more profitable and scaling up their business. But generally, when people call me, it's for two reasons. One, they have a serious problem they need help with, and that could be a cost problem. I get a lot of those. Or it could be, how do I differentiate in the marketplace? So it's a top-line revenue problem. Or the other reason is they have an opportunity to capitalize on. So I've helped a variety of Canadian companies go international. And it didn't take rocket science to see that Germany was going to legalize, and Israel had legalized, and Australia had legalized, and Canada was growing a ton of weed you guys are going to think I'm brilliant, but 2.5 years ago, I said, why don't we take some of that excess inventory and sell it?
Like, wild. What an idea.
That was a big idea for a lot of people. And it's not because they're stupid, but, cannabis people, right? They're in this box. These folks in BC, to get them to even sell their product outside of British Columbia was almost heresy because it didn't satisfy community needs and so on. So I'm not obviously the only one who drove international exports and so on, but you could see how that's become a driver of further innovation, further cost reduction, because all of a sudden you have bigger volumes. And by the way, that's heralding the development of a international global cannabis industry that right now, and no offense to you two guys, and I love America and I love Americans, you guys are missing the boat. And by the time this this industry internationalizes, your big players, let's say Trulieve or Glasshouse, will probably be better off buying one of these large Canadian LPs than being able to grow into it. Because at a certain point, you guys know this, international supply chains get established, processes get established. People don't want to re-engineer the wheel. But, God willing, we'll get to that point where this is more than let's say it is now. It'll be $100 billion industry in the next 2 or 3 years, God willing.
Well, I think those are regulations issues. And you're right. 7 years ago, when I got started in this industry, I didn't envision the United States operators would be locked inside the United States. I envisioned it an opportunity where they would have the ability to expand outside, because I thought there'd be some sensible concepts and an understanding if we wanted to be part of the global supply chain. We had to get outside of the United States, but that's a day for another time. But I think the element that you said of like opening up the thought process of like expanding internationally, right? Like we're here right now, we've got an excess supply. The ability to think outside that box, I think, is that fundamental thought process. Like we're saying is you're applying different principles, right? Kind of the first principle thinking of like currently today, this is how things are going. And we've got an excess supply. And if we wanted to find growth in other areas, we have to figure out strategically where are those different levers going to come from. And sometimes that's really helpful internally, but sometimes that's where I think an outside person like yourself can make a big difference, because an outside voice that you're working with can kind of shine light in areas where like, well, we thought about this before, but it never really made sense. Maybe we should explain it more. But again, I go back to that thought process of an openness to consider outside ideas, which is sometimes a very difficult thing to actually do.
Yeah, number one. And number two is, you sometimes need an outside shit disturber to look, going back to the data, to look at the data and look at your assumptions and say, are these still valid? The biggest lies told in this industry, in my humble opinion, anybody who comes to you and say the TAM of this market is this, they're lying to your face. Okay? Because it'll never happen. Anytime I see a TAM, and I'm not going to call out, the worst protagonists in the sector for this, anytime I see a TAM, I cube root it. And then I ask them the question, when is the TAM going to be achieved? Like anybody could throw out a number. Okay, when are we going to get to that number? And no one goes, I don't know. And that one 3-letter acronym, total addressable market, has been responsible for more value destruction, capital destruction, than anything in the world. And one of the things I do is I address that question and say, okay, how big really is the size of the prize? And if it's this big, how much could we reasonably expect to get? And a lot of this is just math, and you guys understand math really well. And it's actually calculus. And if you plot these numbers, you could start to see that, that size of the prize is a lot more distant in the future and a lot smaller than a lot of people think it is. And we've seen this in every market. They go slower, you get faster price compression, there's less profit. And the problem is capacity is not static. You guys know this. So you invest in the facility, you build up this beautiful cathedral, and guess what? The volume's 10% of what you thought. And now all of a sudden you're effed. Wouldn't it have been better to do the math up front? You don't have to do it with me, but I'm pretty good at math, and say, okay, let's do the math for a bunch of different options and let's see where we're going to go. And the truth is that when I've done this, a lot of companies say, I'm not going to go. I'm not going to invest. I'm going to come around later and I'm going to buy these assets at 10 cents on the dollar. And that is a great strategy. And I can tell you a variety of companies, they're executing very well at it and are going to soon dominate because they're not going to have the legacy issues. They're not going to have the disgruntled shareholders. They're going to buy it for nothing.
Well, first off, it's not as much fun when you're doing 10% of those numbers versus 60% because from a capital standpoint, it's way less. Right. Second, just grow tomatoes, right? Isn't that the approach? Like once you have these cathedrals?
I only know one company that can do that, and they've been very successful, Canadian company, Village Farms, and they are now profitable. Most companies can't necessarily do that because growing cherry tomatoes, believe it or not, isn't a no-brainer. So you're right. The very people who say, I'll just grow tomatoes, what's the big deal? There are existing tomato manufacturers in Mexico, Canada, the United States that are killing it too. And they love when dumbass cannabis people say, I'll grow tomatoes, cucumbers, and peppers. How can that be so hard? Arrogance and hubris is the worst thing for this industry, no matter where you are on the value chain.
So let's talk distress, though, because I think that's a really interesting point. And given the financial situation of some of these U.S. companies, it could be probably sooner rather than later where there's opportunities like that. Do you think the Canadian companies are looking down at the U.S. companies thinking, hey, this might be a really good opportunity time to come in, especially if these positions continue to fault up? Do you think there's specific markets they're looking for, or do you think they're just looking for assets in general?
I think that's a very company-specific strategy. Some Canadian companies have no capital for the United States. So that's number one. And they're just trying to get their Canadian house in order. I endorse that strategy. Other Canadian companies, and I'm going outside of cannabis, have blown their brains out thinking that the United States is just like Canada. And if we win in Canada, we can win in the United States. So we as a people outside of hockey and a few other things don't have a great track record. So those ones, I would often caution against. The Canadian companies I know that have money, are ambitious, and want to deploy capital are doing it very judiciously and are looking for great assets at a very cheap price in healthy markets. So it's not a needle in the haystack. It's more of a hammer in the haystack, and you'll find it. But they get called for money all the time. And the reality is they can afford to be picky because there isn't a lot of capital that's being ready deployed in this industry with people who understand the industry. So like everything else, a lot depends on interest rates, depends on regulations, depends on a whole host of factors. But I think there's going to be a lot of better Canadian companies than what we've seen come into the United States with not only cash, know-how, genetics, all of these things, regulations permitting, where they can grow, they can come and buy great companies, buy great brands, buy great assets, and scale up. We're starting to see this in New York State, starting to see this in Florida, seen it in a couple of Michigan, obviously. It's going to happen.
You think they're just going to be able to acquire a lot of these assets and like flip them into like your standard CGMP quality facility that they built from the ground up in Canada? Or do you think a lot of these facilities might be better off just like kind of acquiring the license, maybe the brand, and then figuring out a way to manufacture it under like the correct conditions that they're executing in Canada?
Brian, Cal, you tee him up and he's like the closer. You know, he asks great questions. So I'm often asked to assess the assets of these companies.
Oh, check it out.
Surprise.
That's a fundamental strategic question because to quote Warren Buffett, the price is what you pay, the value is what you get.
Amen.
Okay? So they asked me to focus on the value. What are they really buying? What's the asset worth? Everybody generally knows assets aren't worth very much anymore. But what's the management team worth? What's the cultivation facility like? I'm not an expert. I'd have to bring in experts, agronomists and so on. But we all can walk around a greenhouse and go, you know, thumbs up, not bad, dog. I can do that. What are the value of their brands? I have methodologies for calculating that too. That is the biggest question they have. And that takes a lot of time because I don't do it for free. So when these companies, and they're not only companies, they're funds as well, when they're looking at U.S. cannabis assets, you know, this particular company has to pass various levels of muster before they deploy me under some sort of due diligence thing. And a lot of the time I've said, no, don't do it because what they're telling you you're getting is actually crap. So a lot of that is around brands. A lot of that is around their team. Like how is their team going to stick around if they're sold to a company? Probably today they would. A year or 2 years from now, they might have been flight risks. So that's a worry. And then what's the likelihood of that license being transferred or sold? And in some markets, there are limited licenses with restrictions around transferability, talking about things like social equity licenses and so on. It's not a no-brainer. So even if you have money and even if you have a willing seller, there's still a big chasm that has to be crossed. I'm one of the people who build one of those bridges, but there's still a lot of heavy lifting that have to be done from the buyer's perspective.
How long does that take just as an estimate? And then are you putting together like a report? Is that what someone can see? Because those are a lot of details, right? And that's not, you can't sit down with somebody over 45 minutes and be like, here's the 6 most important things. There's a lot of fundamental details because essentially you're recommending to them, like, here's what I think, this is what I found.
Yeah, and I don't want to be sued. So I get a lot of these calls. And I'm sure you guys do as well. Tell me about XYZ company. What do you think of their products? What do you think of their brands? And I said, well, what do you mean by what's a brand? Like, are we talking about even the actual same thing? And they said, well, do you like the name of the product? This is what and I go, the name? Who gives an F about the name?
Change it.
What's consumer repurchase like, right? Do they have a price premium versus their competition? That's what I define as a brand. So most people just want a snapshot view.
2 pages? Like, is it like a short 2 pages or are you doing like a 35-page, like Kellen deep book, maybe 60, 100 pages?
When I'm hired, okay. So I'm going to answer. I'm going to get to the answer. When I'm hired, it depends how much time I have. Usually it's a due diligence process. So it could be post a term sheet or a letter of intent to purchase or before that. And in that case, it's 30 to 60 days to do this work. And it's all hands on deck. And I'm probably doing, like you said, 30, 35 pages. And it's all hypothesis driven. So they might say, I don't care about the greenhouse. Just tell me the value of these brands. Or tell me about their capabilities. Is their extraction services as good as they say it is? Right. Okay. No comment. In other cases, before that term sheet or what have you, they've given it, they might say, okay, I need to buy something in Florida. There's a lot for sale. There's true lever control, 70% of the market. I could probably carve out something from the other guys. Who should I go after? Rank them all according to these criteria. And that might be a shorter list because I give that to the CEO or the CFO or the corp dev gal, and they start dialing for dollars based on the list. And that, what I'm giving them is meeting up with the corporate strategy or aligning with the corporate strategy of the acquirer. So if the acquirer is Glasshouse Brands, for example, and they want the best facility because they want the lowest cost, then I'm not going to be looking at everybody. I'm only going to be looking for the largest and the best with the lowest unit, with the best unit economics, right? So it really depends. It's a big question, but I'm often sent off in a specific direction with a mandate as opposed to a blank sheet of paper and doing a whole assessment on everybody.
What about like modeling out future unknowns? For example, interstate commerce, rescheduling, global trade, federal regulations, all of the things we always dream about. Because if someone's making a decision like this from an investment standpoint, they're hoping, 5-10 years from now, and eventually we'll get some of these things, maybe at this point now, hopefully.
Okay, so great question. Again, you're the setup man. So a big part of the strategic planning I do is scenario planning. This industry, that's like two words that it's almost like I invented it for them. I don't know, oil and gas has been doing it for 150 years, automotive. Like, what's the future holding, and how do we mitigate the risks around that and position ourselves for some of the things that are going to happen, consumer trends, so that's a big part of what I do. And sadly, not a lot of these companies do it. Okay. So if to the extent they have a planning horizon, a lot of them are just towards rescheduling right now. They're not thinking about, well, what happens if SAFER comes? They're not thinking about what happens if it doesn't come. They're not thinking about legalization. They're not thinking about a whole host of stuff. And you have to play out these scenarios to figure out how to go to market. So in the case of hemp beverages, as an example, I'm doing scenario planning with the hemp beverage guys because they can gain a market and lose a market in 24 hours. They have to do it. But a lot of time it's trying to convince them to do it, and they're just tunnel vision. It's all about getting into as many gas stations as they possibly can. They don't even think about cannabis beverages. So it's to take somebody's, telescope like this and to broaden it out so they have a much wider horizon and literally standing on a building so you can see in the horizon. And it's not about figuring out exactly what to do. It's just asking the questions and how are we going to prepare for different scenarios and different eventualities. I always say, don't hire me for strategic planning, hire me for strategic thinking. The thinking is what's important. The plan could be a variety of different things.
Yeah, and one of those things that we just talked about there is like, if you have a small cultivation facility and interstate commerce happens, there's no reason to cultivate, right? Just buy it from Glasshouse. And then
Correct.
Your cost of goods goes right down. You have a reliable source. Glasshouse wants that anyway. And this is where we talk about like iteration changes and how strategically things are going to evolve. It all starts with understanding today the way the game operates is not how things evolve in the future. And that involves strategic thinking, decision-making, which when you're talking about acquisition, that has to be considered because the price you're paying for the asset likely is modeled out based on what it's currently doing today, not how all these other variables can come forward and really disrupt it to a point that make it almost mute.
And that's happening in Canada right now. You'd be surprised how many big consumer brands are basically purchased through wholesalers and so on. And that's one of those secrets that not a lot of people talk about, but it's an inevitable evolution of the industry. It's CPG, it's pharma, it's all of that kind of stuff. So, sometimes change happens with a whimper and not a bang. And that's the whimper that's going to encompass every market and every geography, whether we like it or not. You just have to be prepared for it.
What about AI? Does anyone call you and ask you about AI?
Yeah, so I do a lot. I shouldn't do a lot. I have a lot of AI conversations now. The problem is everyone says, yeah, we need AI. And I say, what for? And they go, I don't know. What are the use cases? And there are good use cases in AI, without a doubt. But how does it fit strategically into your business? And do you have, let's talk about operational excellence. AI is great, but where's the data going to come from?
Sensors.
Okay. I agree with you. What if you don't have sensors?
Get sensors.
You see, so AI becomes an operational improvement strategy.
Right, but it's using AI. It starts with putting it on the board and say, okay, what do we want to achieve? We want AI for X, right? And then you work backwards through the process and you're like, okay, we want to understand our true operating costs. How do we get there? Well, we have to figure out these data puts. How do we get them currently? Well, we don't write them down. Let's start writing them down. What about these other ones? We need a sensor. Okay, let's get a sensor. When we have all these, how does that alter our workflow? Once you do all those pieces of the puzzle, you can have a strategic thought. And I think one of the issues with AI that Kel and I have seen, people want it also, but they're petrified of it. They're like, I don't really know. We got to get sign off. Well, don't dump your financial proprietary information into there. Use it as a thought process, as a sparring partner from a thinking through someone. How do we think about these things? What can we consider? What what variables am I not considering in cultivation that I need to think about in order to figure out which metrics are really important to track? That is where AI can make a massive difference, and people don't need custom AI for that. You use ChatGPT.
Yeah, so I publish weekly something called the Cannabis Management Review. So I'm writing an article on an AI copycat strategies in cannabis. And what is it? I have clients who will, enter in enter in prompts and get an instant strategy. And they think, okay, I just got a cannabis strategy. And I said, well, there's a saying, you guys know there's garbage in, garbage out. Do you know where AI information comes from? Spoiler alert, 60 to 70% of it comes from Reddit and Wikipedia. Okay, if Reddit and Wikipedia are not correct, then you're feeding in bad gas to your Lamborghini, and you're going to destroy the engine, right? AI will be good, in my opinion, when you have a closed system and you can actually start bringing your own real data, real operating data from other people. So if somebody has the sensors, you talked about Callan, that's collecting data from a variety of different places, they correlate it. And then let's say it's your company, you feed that data as a service into all these operators, you're going to dominate because you vetted all the inputs that go into that AI engine. Right now, a lot of it's just plain junk. You're going to bring in data, unit costs for cannabis. Which costs is it going to be? Grow costs, pre-processing, post-processing, there's so many opportunities to screw it up. So AI is a tool. I believe in it. But if you don't build the proper foundation and you put that antenna on that building, it's going to collapse on you.
Yeah, I think AI is like you said, its value comes from allowing people to correlate a lot of different data points that previously were isolated. And I think that can provide very deep insights from an optimization standpoint in whatever vertical that their business is currently struggling with.
Absolutely. I'd love to get into an AI business where I'm the data conduit and I own the pipes that go to all these different companies and I sell that data to AI engines within cannabis companies and other ones. I think whoever owns that basically controls the means of production in these companies.
Well, thank you for pitching our services.
Yeah.
Well, guilty as charged. Like, you guys are not stupid.
It's very kind. But at the end of the day, we've just taken the tools like we just talked about. We had a North Star understanding. We understand a critical problem. And then we just chopped it back to a point where it's like, okay, where are we today? Where do we need to go in order to fill in all these blanks? And it turns out that extraction is very difficult. And when you apply guesswork and you don't do all the scientific tracking and the data behaviors like we're talking about, it makes it even harder. And when you have a starting material that's a plant, you've got even more inconsistencies, and layering all of it together just makes it even harder. And when you have a cash-constrained industry, you need tools and you need to figure out how to do that. And that involves with having a North Star and working backwards, which is not the hardest concept, if we're going to be honest.
Yeah. Yeah. So, and I don't want to disparage the entire industry. There's some many smart people in there.
100%.
But
sophisticated operators.
But there's a lot of Stockholm syndrome too.
Yeah.
Definitely.
And there's a lot of echo chamber stuff and so on. And what a lot of people don't understand, again, I'm a historian by background. We're headed toward an extinction event.
Yeah.
That has to happen in this industry. It has to happen because there's not enough capital and talent to go around. So it's like a game of musical chairs. You're not all going to survive. And assuming Glasshouse, as an example, gets through this wave of troubles, and you've got in California 10 chairs, and they own 3 or 4 of them, and the music starts to go. And all of a sudden, all these children won't be able to sit on the Glasshouse chairs. They're going to be competing for even fewer chairs than there were before. And I just tell operators and boards and CEOs, that's typically who I deal with, at the end of the day, whether we like it or not, events are going to transpire that are either going to sink us, accelerate us near the top, or force us into a combination or a marriage with our peers in order to survive.
Mitch, last question. What question do you wish more people asked you?
Wow. I would say, what can we learn, assuming those people are running a company, a cannabis company? I'd like them to ask, what could we learn from outside of our state or our geography and outside of our industry? All the lessons are there.
Perfect. And then for those who want some more lessons, they want to read some of your Substack, where can they find you?
Well, I'm on LinkedIn. I'm a prolific poster. So Mitchell Osak, you can find me easily if we're not connected. My Substack is called the Cannabis Management Review. It's a ripoff of the Harvard Business Review. That's the kind of content I create. And you can find that at mitchellosak.substack.com, mitchellosak.substack.com. But if anybody wanted to talk about business, I've got tons of articles, tons of ideas, and so on. I don't put the meter on immediately. We have to build up a relationship and trust. We can talk about all these strategic issues and even more.
Awesome. Thanks for taking the time. This was a lot of fun.
Thanks, guys. Great job.